For years, Russia had a near monopoly on nuclear energy development in Central Asia. Rosatom was the only serious option on the table. Then Kazakhstan chose China. That decision to award 2 of its 3 planned nuclear power plants to the China National Nuclear Corporation signals something larger than an energy contract. It's a statement about dependency, diversification, and who Central Asia is willing to trust with its most consequential infrastructure. Today we're breaking down what's actually happening with nuclear energy across the region, in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, what it cost, who's building it, and what it means for the countries that will live with the results for the next half-century. I'm Bruce Pannier. I spent 4 decades covering the former Soviet Union. This is Turan Research Center, hosted by the Yorktown Institute, where we break down the geopolitics of Turkey, Iran, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. If you're new here and want more analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's get into it. Joining me today, Sapargali Shalgimbayev, president of CFIVE, a think tank based in Astana and a former diplomat at the Kazakhstani Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Andrew Danierne, associate director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on the panel.
Thank you.
And let's start with the basics. Kazakhstan's building a large plant. Uzbekistan is building a hybrid complex with both small and large reactors. And Kyrgyzstan is looking at 1 or more small reactors. How much electricity does each of these projects actually add?
Just want to highlight that timing feels right. After decades of hesitation following of Chernobyl and Fukushima, governments and investors around the world are taking a fresh look at the nuclear power. And going back to your question, Kazakhstan's NPP complex will generate around 2,400 megawatts. It's about 1 Russian-built unit from Rosatom. And in the future, consortium planning to build another 2, but with the help of Chinese corporation. Uzbekistan hybrid complex could add roughly 2,000 megawatts, and this I know. Kyrgyzstan's small modular reactor would likely produce from 50 to 300 megawatts. Modest, but critical for a country that forces the electricity shortage every winter.
Let me do a follow-up real quick here. Hydro and wind is an option. Why is nuclear so attractive?
The answer is very simple. It's reliability. Solar and wind are intermittent. Hydro is limited by geography and increasingly by climate stress. Central Asian rivers are shrinking. Nuclear given you steady, around-the-clock power regardless of weather or season. For growing economies and that want to attract factories, data centers, and investment, the consistency is not negotiable.
And let me just jump in, Bruce, if I can, on that. I think Sapar is absolutely right that reliability is a key factor in these 3 countries pursuing nuclear energy projects. But I also think they're kind of also pursuing an all-of-the-above approach, where nuclear can be a base load for power, like natural gas often is, and I think that we'll see a combination of those over the medium to long term. But having nuclear doesn't also preclude things like solar, hydro, and wind. We see at the same time Uzbekistan pursuing some pretty large solar arrays as well. So I think it's also possible we'll see other kinds of renewables in the energy mix of Central Asia.
Andrew, then let me follow up for you. What does that number actually mean in the context of each country's existing grid? We have shortages every winter. We hear reports about shortages in these countries, sometimes even in the summer. How much will nuclear power actually help them to make up for the deficit in energy that they're experiencing right now?
So the numbers obviously are quite specific to each country and depend on exactly how much energy generation gets built. But for Kazakhstan, to take an example, I think we're looking for projects that have been agreed at about 10% of what their energy generation needs would be currently, and that percentage could drop a little bit as energy needs increase over the life of these projects, which is why Sapar talked about the nuclear cluster that I think Astana is pursuing, trying to have 2 additional reactors. So these are meaningful additions, adjuncts that again help with baseload and ideally help to smooth out capacity and demand, which is often, as you well know, quite seasonal and in the past has led to these kinds of shortages, especially in the winter. So hopefully over the medium term and long term that these projects would smooth those shortages out.
Okay, thank you for mentioning that. And Sapar, I'd like to ask you a little bit, a question also about this too. Now, we know that the majority of the population in Kazakhstan lives in the eastern part of the country. So it's no coincidence that all 3 of these nuclear power plants are going up in the eastern part of the country. How much will that go towards solving the problems that they have in Astana and Almaty, and of course, looking forward into the future, Almaty, it's one of the cities that they're planning on building in the future. Is this a solution or a partial solution? Or, Andrew mentioned too, the population's growing. So is this just going to hold the line, or are we actually moving forward?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Right now, it's it's a long-term process for the building of a nuclear power plant. It's about 10-15 years, and it's like a big strategy. And for this question, I just want to highlight that on April 15, 2026, President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev signed the Atomic Industry Development Strategy of Kazakhstan to 2050, a landmark document that frames nuclear not as a single infrastructure project, but as a foundation of an entire industrial ecosystem. It covers power generation, uranium management, nuclear science, waste handling, safety, workplace training, and etc. Just the nuclear development drives demand for high-skilled workers, advantage manufacturing, and in the near future, I mean about a decade, we can solve this problem with nuclear power energy.
Okay, gentlemen, these projects are not cheap. Kazakhstan's large plant, Uzbekistan's hybrid complex, even Kyrgyzstan's small reactors. We're talking about some of the biggest infrastructure investments these countries have ever made. Can you give us a rough sense of what each of these is expected to cost, and what does that price tag actually mean for state budgets in this part of the world? Andrew, let's start with you.
I think we have the most information about the Rosatom project in Kazakhstan. I think we're roughly looking at a ballpark of $10 to $15 billion over the life of the project, which is, as Sapar mentioned, I think we're probably looking at between 6 and 10 years of the total from dig to deployment. And I think that actually one interesting element here is I believe the government in Astana has said that they don't want to spend state budget resources on this. So it's going to be a loan from the Russian side, likely from Rosatom, backed up by the Russian government, that will pay for the construction and will be paid out over the life of the many decades of the project with fees from the power that's generated. The projects in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, I believe the financing options are still under discussion. And I think the transparency and financial details is not something necessarily that the Russians are known for. So we might have to do a good bit of digging to get solid numbers on each of these as well.
I'm really curious. Andrew was just walking us through the cost of the big power plant. But the Chinese, when they came in with their bid, it was less than half of what Rosatom is talking about. How can the Chinese build a nuclear power plant at less than half the cost of Rosatom?
Let's be direct here. The reported price of 5 and 5 billion for a Chinese reactor is not credible. Real world experience tells a different story. China built a 2-reactor plant in Pakistan for 9.1 billion, and that was in 2013. adjusted for inflation, that's closer to 12.5 billion in today's dollars. Global benchmarks consistently put large NPP projects in between 10 and 15 billion range. Why does the final price vary so much? Several factors drive cost. It's site condition, seismic risks, weather and soil quality, equipment, and local workforce and materials capacity, and of course logistic and financing costs that add up quickly in a landlocked country. I'm talking about the Kazakhstan right now, and so the 5.5 billion figure is simply not realistic. The full cost of Kazakhstan's three-unit complex will likely be, between 15, maybe 20 billion.
For both of them?
For both of them, yeah.
Okay. If I could just come back for a second to the small nuclear reactor. I recall that when Uzbekistan was planning on building 6 of them, that the Ministry of Energy there said that they didn't think it would even be $2 billion. What does a small nuclear reactor go for then?
Yeah, the idea, it's simple. They're trying to reduce the cost of the project and the security. This because it's when you're building a nuclear power plant like the 150 gigawatts, it's very high risks, as we know. And the small country trying to build the nuclear energy ecosystem from the small steps. I mean, the Kyrgyzstan trying to do this strategy.
Okay. And Bruce, just to jump in, right, the costs are lower on these SMRs, these small modular reactors, because the pieces of them are built modularly. They're built piece by piece rather than custom built like you would in a large nuclear reactor, right? And so that helps keep some of the costs down. Now, I don't have the exact figures in front of me of what we could expect this would cost for Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan, but that's the general idea, is that they're built piece by piece and then assembled like a Lego set rather than put all together in a kind of custom built. And that's one of the things that the Chinese are trying to do for large scale reactors as well. There's a great podcast that Bloomberg does called Odd Lots, and last year they had this excellent episode outlining how the Chinese have been able to drive costs down, whereas costs to build large nuclear reactors in other parts of the world have been increasing. And so I think, when we look at these future projects, we will see a shift toward, if we can say this word, modularization of these, and that could hopefully, for some of these countries, keep costs, relatively speaking, under control.
Is this the small reactors? I'm curious. It seems to be kind of a new technology. What's your understanding about reliability?
So it is a bit untested in some senses. I mean, there's only 2 countries in the world currently that have been able to build and deploy small modular reactors, and that's Russia and China. And Russia's they've done in a floating setting on the water where there's very active cooling capabilities. And so one of the things you look at if you're Uzbekistan, looking at Russian SMRs very likely built on land, is can these Russian reactors, even in a modular sense, be safe on land where they don't have the built-in cooling that they do in the one floating reactor they have now? And of course, the United States and others in Europe and the West are working to rapidly catch up and deploy their own reactors to be competitive in this setting too.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the standard model for these projects is BOOT, right? Build, own, operate, transfer. Contractor builds the plant, runs it, and eventually transfers ownership once the loans are paid off. But in practice, how long does this actually take? And is there a realistic scenario where any of these 3 countries is still making payments to Moscow or Beijing 20 years from now, with the contractor still partially running the plant? Sapar?
Sure. Yeah. Actually, I'm trying to find some information about the agreement and how in what method we will use. like BOO or BOO2, but for now, I guess it's actually still on pipeline, still on the discussion, and we will know in the near future how the Kazakhstan will build these NPPs with Russian partners. But before we don't cover our loan, I guess it will be like on BOO system.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
kind of
just
what I
to give one example there, I mean, like if you look at reactors in that Rosatom has built in a place like Egypt relatively recently, you're looking at, I think it was at the time 3 to 4% interest rate over 22 years. So even in the best case scenario, these countries, like, this is at least a 2 decade project likely in terms of being paid back, and that's without any adverse economic conditions or loan conditions changing. So it is a pretty serious financial commitment over a number of decades, which is why Kazakhstan, and I think smartly, has decided that they don't want to fund this out of the budget directly.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, Kazakhstan sits on roughly 12% of the world's uranium. Kazatomprom is the largest uranium producer on the planet. There's already a Chinese partnership at the Oba plant producing fuel assemblies for reactors in China. How does fuel sourcing work for these new plants? Can the same assemblies produced at Oba serve both Chinese-built and Russian-built plants, or is that not how the technology works? Sapar, let's start with you.
Yeah, Kazakhstan is positioning itself like a regional nuclear fuel hub, and this is an unappreciated part of our connector state strategy. As you mentioned, the Ulba metallurgical plant, where Kazatomprom partners with the China and corporation, produce fuel assessment for Chinese reactor designs. Russian and Chinese reactors use similar technology but different fuel specifications. So assemblies aren't directly interchangeable without some qualification. But long-term, Astana wants to supply fuel to all these reactors being built in the region. That would complete the connector state picture, and Kazakhstan is a country that not only hosts reactors but feeds them.
Andrew, I'd like to get your thoughts on that too. One about the compatibility of fuel assemblies that are done in Kazakhstan or possibly other places. Would they work in both the Russian and the Chinese nuclear power plants? But I'm also curious about something else too. I mean, all three of these countries that we're talking about actually have uranium, and in the past, in the Soviet past, they've actually mined uranium and produced it there. They get some kind of deal for producing their own uranium, or do they have to depend on Russia and China to help them out from start to finish?
Well, I think you hit at what I think the ideal for these countries would be, which would be to have either a regional hub or possibly smaller national hubs for refining and enriching their own uranium. I mean, it's kind of crazy that Kazakhstan, with this blessed with these amazing uranium resources, has to mine the uranium, send it across the border to Russia for enrichment, and then back to Kazakhstan to export it. So I think the Russians certainly love that arrangement, but for Kazakhstan, as Sapar mentioned, as a connector state that wants to be able to have many partners around the world, not only Russia and China, and wants to move itself up the value chain in developing its mineral resources, it makes all the sense in the world to pursue domestic enrichment as well. And same thing for a country like Uzbekistan. So I think that's the ideal that I think these capitals might like to see, although they might not say it, given their big neighbors have significant interests in their own role in the nuclear supply chain. But I think hopefully over the long term, that's something that we could see and would certainly be a benefit to the independence and sovereignty, and not to mention prosperity of countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan.
Okay, we've talked about Rosatom and we've talked about CNNC and what they can do and how much it costs to build a nuclear power plant. But when Kazakhstan put the tender up for the first nuclear power plant it was building, we had a number of of the companies that were bidding for this from France, from the United States, from South Korea, from Canada. What is the future of these foreign companies' participation in nuclear power plants as you see it? I mean, the market isn't locked out to just CNNC and Rosatom, is it? Is there a role for these companies from other countries to participate in this? Sapar?
Sure. We have. I just want to start that with this consortium project, President Tokayev made very wise move because it's genuinely smart by creating a consortium, then put Rosatom and CNNC in the same project, but as competitors, right? One Russian unit, two Chinese units, same site, same deadlines, pressure. What does that achieve? It keeps Kazakhstan's multi-vector foreign policy intact and gives Astana real leverage. If one partner slows down or raises prices, the another is right there. And it puts both Moscow and Beijing in a position where they need to perform rather than dictate terms. For Russian, this is a test of prestige. Rosatom has long dominated nuclear energy in this region. But if Chinese units get built faster, which Beijing track record suggestion in possible, that would mark a shift in the balance of influence across Central Asia. But for other, we still in our atomic strategy will build 5 NPPs, and I guess we have plenty room for US partners, for Canadian and South Korea, of course.
And I'm going to get back to that in a second, but let me just ask Andrew something real quick. In terms of diversity, I mean, everyone's into that, right? That you want a diversity of sources, diversity of technology and stuff. Does it make sense for we talk a lot about Kazakhstan, but we could even throw in Uzbekistan here because they have lots of money also. Do you foresee, just for political reasons, choosing another company from another country to build a nuclear power plant just so they kind of mix it up a little bit?
Well, I think Sapar is right that the main drivers here are economic and about delivery. I mean, in Kazakhstan, we had Russia, China, South Korea, and France bidding for the first kind of nuclear power plant here. And frankly, the Russian and Chinese bids were just more competitive than the French and South Korean ones from a project completion standpoint on the timeline and then on the cost as well. And that's in part because these are state-driven economies, and the governments can offer concessional financing pretty readily, and that's certainly helped the economics and the strategic drive for the nuclear sectors in both of these countries. But I think it's also should be a wake-up for Western countries that our nuclear industry is not necessarily as competitive as it should be around the world. Sapar, at the beginning of our conversation mentioned, we're seeing a kind of nuclear revolution, hopefully in the next few decades here. And the United States and other countries, I think, are not quite where they should be in our ability to permit, process, produce, and build a lot of these nuclear facilities. And so that's something that the United States and other countries will need to look at domestically and then look at exporting that technology. To give another example, we saw Vice President J.D. Vance recently in Armenia and agreed a deal on nuclear fuel and nuclear waste, hopefully with the view to the United States having a role in updating Metsamor there and also building an SMR. But we need to get better at actually building these facilities over the medium term so that the United States companies and others in Europe and East Asia can be competitive in doing exactly that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
May I jump in quickly?
Yeah,
just want to follow up that Andrew idea. The globally this reflects something important. While Western companies is struggling with regulation and the public opposition, Russia and China are exporting reactors as a tool of statecraft. Every deal is about it's more about the electricity. It's about the supply contracts, about influence and maintenance, the dependencies, and trained personnel. and it's that influence lost for decades.
Okay, let's close with the long view. Kazakhstan's planning on building a fourth plant already. Uzbekistan is building. Kyrgyzstan is exploring. Is nuclear power a permanent part of Central Asia's energy future, or is this a one-generation experiment? And do you see more projects coming? And I'm going to ask both of you, so I'll start with Andrew.
I think on Central Asia, whether it's a part of Central Asia for the long term, you should start with Sapar, if you don't mind.
Okay, that's fine. Sapar, can I start with you then?
Sure. Yeah, as I mentioned in the beginning, we'll see the nuclear energy renaissance in the world, and especially Central Asia right now is part of this process. And for Kazakhstan, which signed a new atomic industry development strategy in this April, it's not step. For me, in my opinion, it's a long-term process, and we will see a lot of developments in the near future.
Okay, Andrew, I'm going to ask you that question in just a second, but I want to ask Sapar one more question. The nuclear legacy in Kazakhstan is really bad, obviously. Kyrgyzstan is also, the people are real reluctant to mess with this kind of stuff I mentioned earlier. There's radioactive waste and buried in the ground, and I think every single Central Asian country except Turkmenistan. Do you see any local resistance to this? I mean, I know they're pressing ahead with this anyway, but there's got to be a segment of the population that's not happy with this.
Yes, of course. We have a legacy of the Semipalatinsk polygon, which held about more than 400 nuclear test bombs, and for our oldest generation, it's a quite difficult question. But in my opinion, that's why our government made a referendum and put this question for the that people decided they want and don't want to build NPPs.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, back to the original question. What's the nuclear future of Central Asia look like from your perspective?
Well, I think it's certainly here to stay. These projects are super long term, not only in their building, financing, but also through the life of these projects. I mean, we're talking about many decades for these reactor projects that they'll be operating for. So I think for our lifetimes, certainly that this very likely will be an element of Central Asia's future. I think the main constraining factor is water. Nuclear energy facilities, especially large ones, are super water intensive for cooling and just for in general safety, which is why they're built often by large-ish bodies of water. And in places like Uzbekistan, which is facing intense water stress in a region that's facing intense water stress, I think this could be a limiting factor, or we could be waiting to see technology improve in less water-intensive methods of developing these sorts of reactors. But I think a constraining factor is Central Asia needs to figure out its own water politics and dynamics, because some countries in the region are going to feel greater effects more quickly. But it will affect the overall stability of the region. And they should be looking at new technologies, not only in the energy sphere and in things like nuclear, but also in the water saving sphere, things like irrigation, things like cloud seeding. All of these technologies should be on the table for governments and private sector procurement.
Okay. Sapargali, Andrew, thank you both for being on the program. That's our breakdown of nuclear energy in Central Asia, what's being built, who's building it, and what it means for the region over the next 50 years. Links to further reading are in the description. Let me know in the comments. Is Kazakhstan's pivot to Chinese nuclear technology a smart hedge, or just a trading one dependency for another? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.